Hey, tonight we're diving into a fascinating journey through one of history's darkest yet most transformative periods. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake before dawn to the sound of church bells tolling, not for morning prayers, but for the dead. The bronze bells that once marked the hours with comforting regularity now serve as a constant reminder of mortality, their deep voices echoing across the stone buildings of your medieval city with each new soul that has departed during the night. Through the thick glass window of your modest home, a luxury that marks your status as a learned man, you can see the first grey light of dawn illuminating streets that were once bustling with merchants, children, and the everyday chaos of urban life. Now those same streets lie mostly empty, save for the occasional hurried figure wrapped in cloth, pressing a bundle of herbs to their nose as they scurry between shadows. You are Dr. Guillaume de Montpellier, trained in the medical arts at the University of Paris, and for the past 3 months, you have served as one of the city's plague doctors, a position that pays handsomely because so few men are willing to accept what many consider a death sentence disguised as employment. Your leather bag sits beside your bed, packed with the tools of your trade, small glass vials filled with various tinctures, a brass balance for measuring medicinal compounds, several scrolls containing copied passages from Galen and Hippocrates, and most importantly, a small container of Theriac, the legendary cure-all that combines over 60 ingredients and costs more than most families see in a year. These remedies represent the pinnacle of 14th century medical knowledge, though you're beginning to suspect that knowledge might be woefully inadequate against the enemy you face daily. But first, before you can tend to the sick and dying, you must undergo the ritual that has defined your existence for these past months, donning the costume that marks you as a plague doctor and, theoretically, protects you from the miasma, the poisonous air that most physicians believe carries the pestilence from person to person. You begin with the leather robe, a garment that extends from your neck to your ankles and has been treated with oil and wax until it's nearly waterproof. The leather is thick enough to provide a barrier between your skin and the outside world, though whether this barrier actually protects you from disease remains a matter of desperate hope rather than proven fact. The robe weighs heavily on your shoulders, and its stiffness makes every movement deliberate and awkward. Medieval physicians believed that the plague traveled through corrupted air that could penetrate ordinary clothing, so this leather cocoon was designed to create an impermeable shell around your body. Over the robe goes a wide-brimmed hat, also made of oiled leather, that shields your eyes from the sun and marks your profession to anyone who might see you approaching. The hat serves a practical purpose beyond protection. It signals to the healthy that they should avoid you, and to the sick that help, however limited, has arrived. In a time when medical knowledge was scarce and largely ineffective, the psychological impact of a physician's presence often provided the only comfort available to the suffering. But the most distinctive element of your costume, the piece that will define the popular image of plague doctors for centuries to come, is the mask. You lift it from its resting place with the reverence due to an object upon which your life may depend, though you're increasingly doubtful about its protective powers. The mask is crafted from leather that has been molded into the shape of a bird's head, with a long, curved beak that extends nearly a foot from your face. The beak isn't merely decorative, it's designed to house the aromatic substances that medieval physicians believed would purify the corrupted air before it reached your lungs. Glass eyepieces, round and slightly yellow-tinted, allow you to see while creating another barrier between your body and the infectious environment. You carefully pack the beak with your daily mixture of protective herbs and substances. Today's blend includes dried rose petals, ground cinnamon, powdered unicorn horn, actually ground narwhal tusk, though few know the difference, and several aromatic herbs like thyme, rosemary, and mint. The theory behind this mixture is sophisticated for its time. Physicians believed that pleasant, strong scents could overpower the corrupted air that carried disease, creating a protective bubble of purified atmosphere around the doctor's face. The reality, of course, is far different from the theory. The mask provides no actual protection against the bacterial infection that causes bubonic plague, and the aromatic herbs, while pleasant-smelling, are powerless against the fleas that carry Yersinia pestis from rats to humans. But you don't know this. No one in your century understands the role of bacteria, fleas, or rats in disease transmission. Your mask represents the best medical science of your time, sophisticated, logical within its theoretical framework, and tragically ineffective. As you adjust the leather straps that hold the mask in place, you're acutely aware of how the costume transforms you from Dr. Guillaume, respected physician and member of the community, into something almost inhuman. The mask muffles your voice, giving it an otherworldly quality that frightens children and unsettles adults. The long beak creates distance between you and your patients, making physical examination difficult and personal connection nearly impossible. This transformation isn't accidental. Medieval society understood that plague doctors occupied a liminal space between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Your costume marks you as someone who moves freely between these worlds, who touches the infected and dying but somehow returns each evening to the land of the healthy. The bird-like appearance isn't just practical, it's symbolic, evoking ravens and other carrion birds that feed on the dead. Fully costumed now, you pick up your staff, a long wooden rod that allows you to examine patients without direct physical contact. The staff serves multiple purposes. It maintains distance between you and potentially infectious patients, it allows you to lift clothing or bedsheets for examination without using your hands, and it provides a tool for pointing to affected areas while discussing symptoms with family members who maintain their own careful distance. The morning air hits your masked face as you step outside, filtered through the aromatic herbs in your beak but carrying with it the unmistakable sense of a city under siege by disease. Wood smoke from funeral pyres mingles with the smell of lime that citizens scatter in the streets to combat what they believe is corrupted air. Beneath these dominant odors lies something else, the sweet, cloying scent of decay that no amount of lime or aromatic herbs can entirely mask. Your first call takes you through the artisan quarter, where shops that once rang with the sounds of hammering, weaving, and commerce now stand shuttered and silent. Many of the craftsmen who gave this neighborhood its character have either fled the city or succumbed to the plague. Those who remain have barricaded themselves behind closed doors, emerging only when necessity demands and maintaining careful distance from anyone they encounter. The house you approach belongs to Master Thomas, a goldsmith whose work once adorned the fingers and necks of the city's wealthy merchants. Now his workshop is silent, and his family has sent word that the plague has entered their home. You knock on the door with your staff, maintaining the prescribed distance while announcing your arrival. The door opens to reveal Thomas's wife, Marie, though you barely recognize the woman who once carried herself with the confidence that comes from prosperity and social standing. Her face is gaunt, her hair unkempt, and her eyes hold the hollow look of someone who has watched death claim people she loves. She gestures toward the stairs with a trembling hand, unable or unwilling to speak. Climbing the narrow stairs to the upper floor where the family's bedrooms are located, you're struck by how the plague has transformed this once comfortable home. The tapestries that once demonstrated the family's wealth hang askew and dusty. The wooden floors, normally polished to a warm glow, are stained and scattered with herbs that family members have spread in hopes of purifying the air. In the largest bedroom, you find Master Thomas himself, and the sight that greets you is one that has become terrifyingly familiar over these past months. The goldsmith lies on a bed that reeks of sweat, urine, and the peculiar sweet odor that accompanies the plague's final stages. His body is racked with fever, causing him to alternate between violent shivering and periods where he throws off his blankets in desperate attempts to cool himself. But it's the swellings that mark this definitively as plague, the buboes that give bubonic plague its name. Thomas has developed large, painful lumps in his groin and under his arms, swellings that have grown to the size of chicken eggs and turned an ominous dark color. These buboes represent the lymph node's desperate attempt to filter the bacterial infection from his bloodstream, but instead of providing protection, they've become reservoirs of pain and infection. Using your staff to lift the bedsheet, you examine the patient while maintaining your careful distance. Medieval medical theory attributed Thomas's condition to an imbalance in his bodily humors, the four fluids that physicians believed governed health and disease. According to this understanding, the plague represented an excess of corrupted blood and black bile, requiring treatments designed to restore proper balance. You prescribe the standard remedies that medical training has taught you to employ against plague. First, bloodletting to drain the excess corrupted blood from Thomas's system. Marie will need to make small cuts in her husband's arms and allow a measured amount of blood to flow into a basin. The theory holds that removing corrupted blood will allow healthy blood to take its place, though in reality, this treatment only weakens patients who are already fighting for their lives. Second, you recommend applying hot poultices to the buboes to encourage them to rupture and drain. Medieval physicians believed that the swellings contained concentrated poison that needed to be expelled from the body. The hot compresses cause excruciating pain but occasionally do help buboes to burst and provide temporary relief from pressure. Third, you prescribe a mixture of theriac and wine to be administered 3 times daily. Theriac, that expensive cure-all containing everything from viper's flesh to exotic spices, represents the pinnacle of medieval pharmaceutical science. Its complexity and cost give both physician and patient confidence in its efficacy, though it has no actual power against bacterial infections. Finally, you recommend burning aromatic woods and herbs throughout the house to purify the air and prevent the plague from spreading to other family members. This advice reflects the miasma theory that dominates medical thinking, the belief that disease travels through corrupted air and can be countered by pleasant, strong scents. As you deliver these prescriptions, speaking through your mask in the muffled, otherworldly voice that has become your trademark, you're aware of Marie's desperate attention to every word. She clings to your instructions as a drowning person clings to a rope, investing them with power they don't possess because the alternative is to accept that nothing can be done for her husband. This scene, the ineffective treatments, the desperate families, the growing certainty that your medicine is powerless against this disease, has repeated itself dozens of times over these past months. You've watched respected citizens, innocent children, and fellow physicians succumb to the plague despite receiving the best medical care available. Your leather costume and aromatic mask have failed to protect you from the psychological toll of constant exposure to suffering you cannot alleviate. Leaving Thomas's house, you walk through streets that have been transformed by 3 months of plague into something resembling a battlefield after the fighting has moved on. Houses stand empty with doors hanging open, their residents either dead or fled. Shops that once competed fiercely for customers now display identical signs, closed due to pestilence or simply gone to God. The city's normal social structure has collapsed under the pressure of mass mortality. Servants have abandoned wealthy households when their masters fell ill. Merchants have fled, leaving valuable goods unguarded. Even the clergy, traditionally expected to remain with their flocks during times of crisis, have proven alarmingly mortal, with many priests and monks succumbing to the disease they encountered while administering last rites. Your next patient lives in the poorest quarter of the city, where narrow streets and cramped housing have made the plague spread particularly rapid and devastating. The family cannot afford your normal fees, but the city council has agreed to pay for medical care for the indigent, understanding that untreated plague victims pose a threat to everyone regardless of social class. The hovel you enter, it can hardly be called a house, contains an entire family in various stages of the disease. The father died 3 days ago and still lies in the corner, wrapped in a stain sheet because no one has come to remove the body. The mother struggles with the early symptoms, fever, chills, and the telltale swellings beginning to appear in her groin. 2 children, perhaps 8 and 10 years old, huddle together on a pile of straw, their faces flushed with fever and their eyes bright with the peculiar intensity that often accompanies plague in the young. Here, in this cramped, fetid space, the limitations of your medical knowledge become most apparent. Your expensive remedies, the bloodletting, the poultices, the theriac, are useless against a bacterial infection that your century lacks the scientific framework to understand. Your protective costume, while it may provide some psychological comfort, offers no real defense against fleas that can easily penetrate leather and cloth. Yet you go through the motions anyway, prescribing treatments that you increasingly doubt, because the alternative is to admit that medicine has no power against this enemy. You examine the children with your staff, noting the progression of their symptoms, calculating how long they might have before the disease reaches its final stages. Medieval medicine was built on logical principles that made sense within the theoretical framework available to 14th century physicians. The humoral theory that guided your treatments had successfully explained health and disease for over 1,000 years. The miasma theory that justified your protective mask represented sophisticated thinking about how illness might spread through communities. But logic based on incomplete information can lead to conclusions that are both reasonable and wrong. Your mask protects against airborne transmission that isn't actually how plague spreads. Your bloodletting treatments attempt to correct humoral imbalances that don't actually exist. Your aromatic herbs try to purify air that isn't actually the source of infection. The tragedy isn't that medieval medicine was primitive or foolish, it's that it was carefully reasoned, scientifically rigorous within its limitations, and utterly inadequate against a bacterial infection that wouldn't be understood for another 500 years. As you move through the city from patient to patient, you're followed by a small entourage that has become part of your daily routine. 2 men with handcarts collect the dead from houses you've visited, wrapping bodies in shrouds and transporting them to mass graves outside the city walls. A clerk records the names and addresses of those who have died, maintaining the grim statistics that will help future generations understand the scope of this catastrophe. Behind them walks Father Benedict, one of the few clergy members who has remained in the city throughout the plague's worst months. He administers last rites to dying patients and offers what spiritual comfort he can to grieving families. His presence reminds you that medicine and religion work together in medieval society, with physicians treating the body while priests tend to the soul. Father Benedict's survival, like your own, raises uncomfortable questions about why some people remain healthy while others succumb to the plague. Medieval people explained this through various theories: divine favor, moral purity, superior constitution, or simply luck. Modern science would eventually identify genetic factors, bacterial load, flea exposure, and other variables that influence susceptibility to Yersinia pestis. But in your time, survival seems random and inexplicable, adding to the terror that grips communities facing plague outbreaks. Families watch helplessly as some members sicken and die while others remain healthy despite constant exposure. Children sometimes survive while their parents perish. The elderly occasionally outlive the young and strong. This apparent randomness challenges medieval understanding of divine justice and natural order. If the plague were truly God's punishment for sin, shouldn't the virtuous be spared while the wicked suffer? If disease results from humoral imbalances, shouldn't similar people living similar lives experience similar outcomes? These questions haunt you as you continue your rounds, visiting house after house where your expensive education and sophisticated remedies prove powerless against bacterial infection. Your mask, with its aromatic herbs and symbolic power, becomes increasingly burdensome as evidence mounts that it provides no real protection. By midday, the heat inside your leather costume has become nearly unbearable. The thick hide that was designed to protect you from corrupted air now traps your body heat and makes every movement an effort. Sweat runs down your face inside the mask, mixing with the aromatic oils from the herbs to create a pungent mixture that stings your eyes and makes breathing difficult. You pause in a small square where a fountain once provided fresh water for the neighborhood. The fountain still runs, but no one comes to draw water anymore. Too many people have died near this spot, and survivors fear that the plague might somehow contaminate the water itself. Medieval people understood that disease could spread through water, though they didn't understand the specific mechanisms involved. Removing your mask briefly to drink from your personal water flask, you're struck by how the simple act of breathing unfiltered air feels both liberating and terrifying. Your face, exposed now to the atmosphere that you've spent months trying to avoid, feels vulnerable and naked. The contrast between the stifling interior of your mask and the open air reminds you of how your profession has isolated you from normal human contact. Plague doctors occupied a unique and lonely position in medieval society. You were essential but feared, respected but avoided, well paid but constantly exposed to death. Children ran when they saw your distinctive silhouette approaching. Adults crossed streets to avoid walking near you. Even your own family maintained careful distance when you returned home each evening. This isolation wasn't just social, it was existential. Daily exposure to mass mortality had given you a perspective on life and death that few of your contemporaries shared. You had watched entire families perish within days. You had seen the plague reduce strong men to delirious, pain-racked shadows of themselves. You had observed how quickly the social bonds that hold communities together could dissolve under pressure of overwhelming mortality. Medieval people generally died surrounded by family, friends, and clergy who helped ease the transition from life to death. But plague victims often died alone, abandoned by relatives who feared infection, creating a new kind of death that violated all social and religious norms about proper dying. Your afternoon calls take you to the merchant quarter, where the plague has claimed some of the city's most prominent citizens. Here, in houses filled with expensive tapestries and imported furniture, wealthy families have discovered that money provides no protection against bacterial infection. The same symptoms that you've observed in poor hovels appear here in marble-floored rooms: the fever, the delirium, the agonizing buboes, the inevitable progression toward death. Master Richard, the city's most successful cloth merchant, lies dying in a bed that costs more than most people earn in several years. His wife has fled to her family's estates in the countryside, taking their young children and most of their portable wealth. Only a handful of servants remain, and they maintain careful distance while providing minimal care. Richard's case illustrates how the plague has disrupted normal social relationships and family obligations. Medieval society was built on networks of mutual responsibility. Masters cared for servants, parents protected children, spouses supported each other through hardship. But the plague's apparent contagiousness has made these traditional obligations seem dangerous, forcing people to choose between duty and survival. You examine Richard using the same techniques and remedies that you've employed with poor patients, because medical science makes no distinction between social classes when confronting disease. The expensive decoration surrounding his bed cannot change the basic reality that your treatments are ineffective against bacterial infection. But Richard's wealth does allow him access to more exotic remedies. His family has purchased powdered emerald, which some physicians believe can neutralize poison in the blood. They've obtained blessed relics from 3 different saints known for their healing powers. They've hired additional doctors to provide second and third opinions about treatment. None of these expensive interventions will save Richard's life, but they demonstrate how plague has created new markets for hope and desperation. Merchants who once sold silk and spices now trade in miraculous cures and protective amulets. Physicians who once treated routine ailments now command enormous fees for treating plague victims. The economics of plague medicine reflect medieval understanding that serious diseases require serious interventions. If ordinary remedies were effective against the plague, the reasoning goes, then the disease wouldn't be claiming so many lives. Therefore, successful treatment must require extraordinary measures, rare ingredients, complex preparations, expensive procedures. This logic leads to increasingly elaborate and costly treatments that have no actual efficacy against bacterial infections. Patients consume preparations containing ground pearls, unicorn horn, and Egyptian mummy powder. They submit to bloodletting procedures that remove dangerous amounts of blood. They endure painful applications of hot irons designed to burn out the infection. These treatments satisfy the medieval need to fight disease with proportional force, but they often kill patients faster than the plague itself would. Your medical training emphasized aggressive intervention based on classical authorities like Galen and Avicenna, but you're beginning to suspect that gentler approaches might sometimes be more effective. As evening approaches and you complete your daily rounds, your body aches from hours of wearing the heavy leather costume in summer heat. Your mask has become a torture device that restricts breathing, limits vision, and amplifies every sound into an echoing distortion. The aromatic herbs that were fresh this morning have now become a sticky, pungent mass that sticks to your face and clothes. But removing the costume feels almost as difficult as wearing it. Over these past months, the mask and robes have become a psychological barrier as much as a physical one. Putting them on each morning requires you to accept the day's exposure to death and suffering. Taking them off each evening forces you to confront how little you've accomplished despite your best efforts. You walk slowly through streets that have grown quiet as darkness falls. Medieval cities normally came alive in the evening hours, with taverns filling with customers, families gathering for evening meals, and young people meeting for conversation and courtship. But plague has silenced these evening rhythms, leaving streets empty except for the occasional hurried figure rushing between destinations. The silence feels oppressive after months of normal urban noise. No children playing in the streets. No merchants calling out their wares. No church bells marking the hours. Many bell ringers have died, and the constant tolling for the dead has created a grim association that makes the sound more disturbing than comforting. Your own house, when you finally reach it, feels like a sanctuary and a prison simultaneously. Inside these walls, you can remove the costume that marks you as a plague doctor and return to being simply Guillaume, a man trying to survive in impossible circumstances. But you also know that tomorrow morning you'll put the costume on again and repeat today's futile rounds through a city that grows smaller with each passing week. Your wife, Claire, maintains the careful distance that has characterized your relationship since you accepted the position of plague doctor. She prepares your meals and leaves them outside your chamber door. She washes your regular clothes but refuses to handle the leather costume. She speaks to you from across rooms, never approaching close enough for normal conversation. This domestic isolation reflects the broader social isolation that plague doctors experience. Your profession requires you to move between the world of the sick and the world of the healthy, but you never fully belong to either. The healthy fear you as a potential source of infection. The sick see you as their last hope, investing you with power you don't actually possess. Medieval medicine was as much about providing comfort and maintaining hope as it was about curing disease. Patients and families needed to believe that something could be done, that suffering had meaning, that death might be prevented or at least postponed. Your presence, regardless of your actual effectiveness, represented the possibility that human knowledge and skill could triumph over disease. But months of failure have worn away your own faith in medical intervention. You've watched too many patients die despite receiving the best care available. You've seen your most expensive remedies prove worthless against bacterial infection. You've experienced how your protective costume provides psychological comfort while offering no real protection. As you prepare for bed, carefully storing your costume for tomorrow's use, you reflect on how the plague has changed not just your city but your understanding of medicine itself. The confident assertions of classical authorities like Galen now seem questionable when confronted with a disease that defies all traditional treatments. Medieval medical education was built on the assumption that ancient Greek and Roman physicians had solved the fundamental problems of understanding and treating disease. Students like yourself memorized texts, learned established procedures, and absorbed theoretical frameworks that had remained unchanged for centuries. But the plague has revealed limitations in this classical knowledge that cannot be ignored or explained away. If the miasma theory were correct, your aromatic mask should provide protection. If humoral theory accurately described disease, bloodletting should restore balance and health. If Theriac truly functioned as a universal remedy, it should cure plague victims. The failure of these approaches suggests that medical knowledge itself might be incomplete or incorrect, a possibility that challenges the foundations of medieval intellectual life. If classical authorities could be wrong about medicine, what other accepted truths might be equally questionable? These thoughts trouble your sleep, mixing with dreams where you wander through empty streets wearing a mask that grows heavier with each step. In your dreams, the costume that was supposed to protect you becomes a burden that you cannot remove, transforming you into something neither fully human nor entirely other. Morning comes too soon, announced by church bells tolling for the dead and the familiar sounds of your city struggling to maintain basic functions despite catastrophic population loss. You wake knowing that today will bring more patients you cannot help, more families you cannot comfort, more evidence that your medical knowledge is inadequate against this bacterial enemy. But you also wake knowing that you'll put on the costume anyway, because the alternative, admitting that medicine has no power against the plague, would destroy the last hope that keeps communities functioning during catastrophic mortality. Your mask may not work, your treatments may be useless, but your presence represents humanity's refusal to surrender to disease without a fight. The plague doctor's role was never really about curing disease, it was about maintaining the human conviction that knowledge, skill, and determination could triumph over apparently impossible challenges. Your leather costume and bird-like mask may have provided no actual protection, but they symbolized medieval society's commitment to fighting death with every tool available. And perhaps that symbolic function was as important as any medical intervention could have been. In a world where bacterial infections remained mysterious and antibiotics lay centuries in the future, the image of a physician walking fearlessly among the sick represented hope itself, dressed in leather and perfumed with aromatic herbs that couldn't cure disease but could sustain the human spirit through humanity's darkest hours. Your third month as a plague doctor has taught you things that no university could have prepared you for. You've learned that the human body can endure unimaginable suffering while clinging to life with desperate tenacity. You've discovered that families can be torn apart by fear more effectively than by death itself. You've witnessed how quickly the social fabric that holds communities together can unravel when survival becomes the only priority. But perhaps most disturbing of all, you've begun to question the very foundations of the medical knowledge that justified your expensive education and prestigious position in society. Every treatment you've administered has failed. Every theory you've applied has proven inadequate. Every confident assertion from classical authorities has crumbled when confronted with the reality of bacterial infection. This morning brings news that another physician has succumbed to the plague. Master Unri, who trained at the same university as yourself and whose expertise in surgery was renowned throughout the region, died during the night despite wearing the same protective costume, following the same precautions, and treating himself with the same remedies he prescribed for others. His death sends shock waves through the small community of medical professionals who remain in the city. If Unri, careful, knowledgeable, experienced Unri, could not protect himself from the plague, what hope do any of you have? The psychological impact of losing another colleague weighs heavily as you prepare for your daily rounds, each strap of your leather costume feeling more like a burial shroud than protective equipment. You make your way through streets that have grown even quieter overnight. The plague's progression through your city has created distinct zones of devastation, areas where entire neighborhoods have been abandoned to the dead and dying. Your route now takes you primarily through these ghost districts, where survivors barricade themselves behind closed doors and emerge only when absolutely necessary. The house that served as Master Unri's clinic stands empty now, its door marked with the red cross that signifies plague contamination. Inside, are valuable medical instruments, rare books, and stockpiles of expensive remedies that no one dares claim. The building has become a monument to the futility of medical intervention against this particular enemy. Medieval physicians were accustomed to high mortality rates among their patients. Surgery was crude and dangerous, infection was poorly understood, and many conditions that modern medicine treats routinely were essentially death sentences. But the plague was different. It killed not just patients, but physicians themselves, striking down the healers along with those they tried to help. This indiscriminate mortality challenged medieval assumptions about the relationship between knowledge and power. Physicians occupied positions of respect in society partly because their education and skills seemed to provide some measure of control over life and death. But when doctors died at the same rates as everyone else, their special status began to seem illusory. Your first patient of the day is a young woman named Isabella, the daughter of a prosperous baker whose shop once supplied bread to half the city. She's developed the telltale symptoms, fever, chills, and the beginning of bubonic swellings in her groin and neck. But Isabella is also pregnant, presenting medical challenges that your training never adequately addressed. Medieval obstetrics was primitive even by the standards of 14th century medicine. Pregnancy and childbirth were understood primarily through folk wisdom passed down among women, with physicians playing minimal roles except in crisis situations. Now the plague has created a crisis that no amount of folk wisdom can address. What happens when a pregnant woman contracts a disease that kills most of its victims? Isabella's family has called for you because they believe medical intervention might save both mother and child. They've heard rumors of plague victims who recovered after receiving proper treatment, though these recoveries had nothing to do with medical care and everything to do with individual immune responses that medicine couldn't predict or influence. Using your staff to examine Isabella while maintaining careful distance, you note that her symptoms are progressing rapidly. The fever that began yesterday has intensified overnight, and the bubonic swellings are growing larger and more painful by the hour. Medieval medical theory would attribute this rapid progression to the patient's corrupted humoral balance being further disturbed by pregnancy. You prescribe the standard treatments, bloodletting, aromatic poultices, theriac, while privately knowing that these interventions are more likely to harm than help a pregnant woman already weakened by disease. The bloodletting that might theoretically help a strong adult male could easily kill a pregnant woman whose body is already stressed by supporting 2 lives. But Isabella's family expects medical intervention, and refusing to provide treatment would violate your professional obligations even when that treatment might be counterproductive. Medieval physicians faced this ethical dilemma regularly. How do you balance professional duty against growing evidence that your methods are ineffective or harmful? The theriac you prescribe for Isabella costs her family nearly a month's income, money they can barely afford now that the father's bakery has been closed for weeks due to plague contamination. Medieval medicine was expensive partly because rare ingredients were genuinely costly to obtain, and partly because high prices reinforced the perception that valuable treatments must be effective. Isabella's case illustrates how the plague has created new categories of victims beyond those who actually contract the disease. Her family is being financially ruined by medical expenses that will not save her life. Other family members are risking their own health by remaining close enough to provide care. The entire household's future is being destroyed by a bacterial infection that medical science cannot treat or prevent. As you leave Isabella's house, you encounter a scene that has become increasingly common during these plague months, a group of flagellants moving through the street in a procession of ritualized self-punishment. These religious extremists believe that the plague represents God's punishment for human sin, and that sufficient penance might persuade divine mercy to end the catastrophe. The flagellants march through the city wearing only rough sackcloth, carrying heavy wooden crosses, and periodically stopping to whip themselves with leather scourges until their backs run with blood. Their leader, a wild-eyed man who claims to have received divine visions, preaches that medical intervention is useless because the plague can only be ended through spiritual rather than physical means. Watching this procession, you feel an uncomfortable recognition that the flagellants' theology might be more realistic than your medical theories. Their belief that human intervention cannot stop the plague aligns more closely with observable reality than your confidence in classical medical authorities. Their acceptance of powerlessness might be psychologically healthier than your persistent faith in treatments that demonstrably fail. Medieval society offered multiple explanatory frameworks for understanding catastrophic mortality. Religious authorities attributed the plague to divine punishment or spiritual warfare. Medical authorities blamed humoral imbalances or corrupted air. Folk wisdom pointed to astrological influences or supernatural interventions. Each framework provided different strategies for response, but none proved effective against bacterial infection. The flagellants represent one extreme response, total acceptance of human powerlessness combined with desperate attempts to influence divine will through self-punishment. Your medical approach represents the opposite extreme, confident assertion that human knowledge and intervention can combat disease through rational application of established principles. But months of failure have begun to blur the distinctions between these approaches. Your expensive treatments have proven no more effective than the flagellants' bloody rituals. Your sophisticated theories have predicted outcomes no better than folk superstitions. Your university education has provided no practical advantages over religious fanaticism when confronting bacterial infection. This realization creates a crisis of professional identity that extends beyond individual doubt to challenge the entire structure of medieval intellectual authority. If physicians cannot heal disease, if scholars cannot explain natural phenomena, if educated elites cannot provide practical solutions to community problems, then what justifies their privileged position in society? Your afternoon rounds take you to the Cathedral District, where the plague has claimed several prominent clergy members and forced changes in religious practices that would have been unthinkable just months ago. Mass is no longer celebrated daily because too few priests remain alive to conduct services. Confession is offered only under extraordinary circumstances because priests fear infection from close contact with penitents. Even last rites, the final sacrament that Catholics consider essential for salvation, are now administered from a distance, with priests extending blessed objects on long poles rather than approaching dying patients directly. These modifications represent practical accommodations to plague transmission, but they also symbolize how catastrophic mortality can force changes in humanity's most sacred traditions. The cathedral itself shows signs of the social disruption that plague has created throughout the city. Valuable items that would normally be heavily guarded now sit unprotected because too few people remain to maintain normal security arrangements. Some windows have been broken and not repaired. Parts of the building show damage from fires that were allowed to burn longer than usual because volunteer firefighters have died or fled. Your patient in this district is Canon Robert, a high-ranking church official whose theological expertise was once sought by bishops and abbots throughout the region. Now he lies dying in a small chamber behind the cathedral, attended only by a single terrified novice monk who maintains careful distance while providing minimal care. Canon Robert's case illustrates how the plague has affected different social classes with democratic cruelty. His theological knowledge, social position, and access to excellent medical care have provided no protection against bacterial infection. He suffers the same symptoms, experiences the same agony, and faces the same inevitable outcome as the poorest peasants in the city's most squalid districts. Medieval society was built on the assumption that social hierarchies reflected natural and divine order. Kings ruled because God appointed them. Nobles commanded because birth and breeding made them superior. Scholars led because education gave them special access to truth. But the plague's indiscriminate mortality challenges these assumptions by demonstrating that bacteria recognize no social distinctions. Canon Robert's theological training has led him to interpret his illness as a spiritual trial rather than a medical condition. He refuses most of your prescribed treatments, preferring to rely on prayer, fasting, and contemplation of religious texts. His approach to dying represents a different kind of medieval response to plague, acceptance of mortality combined with focus on spiritual rather than physical preparation. You find yourself respecting Canon Robert's approach more than you expected. His calm acceptance of death contrasts favorably with the desperate struggles of patients who submit to painful and useless medical treatments in hopes of recovery. His focus on spiritual preparation seems more realistic than continued faith in remedies that have failed repeatedly. Medieval Christianity provided sophisticated frameworks for understanding suffering, mortality, and the relationship between earthly life and eternal destiny. These frameworks didn't necessarily help people avoid death, but they did help people face death with dignity and meaning. Your medical training, by contrast, offered confidence about treating disease but little guidance for accepting treatment failure. As evening approaches and you complete your daily rounds, the weight of accumulated failure presses down on you like a physical burden. Today, like every day for the past 3 months, your medical interventions have accomplished nothing measurable. The patients you treated this morning are no better than they were yesterday. The families you counseled have no more reason for hope than they had before your visit. The leather costume that you put on with such care each morning now feels like mockery, elaborate preparation for tasks that cannot be completed, sophisticated equipment for work that cannot be done effectively. The aromatic herbs in your mask have provided no protection against a disease that spreads through flea bites rather than corrupted air. The classical theories that justified your treatments have been contradicted by every patient outcome. But perhaps most troubling of all, you've begun to suspect that some patients might actually recover faster without medical intervention. The bloodletting that medical theory demands weakens people who need all their strength to fight infection. The violent purging that classical authorities recommend dehydrates patients who are already struggling to maintain bodily functions. Medieval medicine was often more harmful than helpful, though practitioners couldn't recognize this because they lacked understanding of bacterial infections, immune responses, and the body's natural healing mechanisms. Well-intentioned treatments frequently killed patients faster than diseases would have killed them naturally. Your growing awareness of medicine's limitations creates profound ethical dilemmas about how to practice your profession responsibly. Should you continue prescribing treatments that you increasingly doubt? Should you admit to patients and families that medical science has no effective remedies for plague? Should you abandon your calling entirely rather than continue providing false hope? These questions have no clear answers within the intellectual frameworks available to 14th century physicians. Medieval medical education emphasized confidence in established authorities and aggressive intervention based on classical theories. Admitting uncertainty or recommending minimal treatment violated professional norms and social expectations. But continuing to practice ineffective medicine violates different ethical principles: honesty, humility, and the fundamental medical obligation to do no harm. The plague has created situations where professional duty conflicts with moral responsibility, where intellectual honesty challenges social stability, where individual conscience contradicts collective need. Walking home through streets that grow darker and quieter each evening, you reflect on how the plague has changed not just your city but your understanding of human knowledge itself. The confident assertions that characterized your university education now seem naive when confronted with bacterial enemies that medical science cannot comprehend or combat. Medieval intellectual culture was built on the assumption that ancient authorities had solved the fundamental problems of understanding natural phenomena. Students learned by memorizing established texts rather than conducting original research. Scholars advanced by interpreting classical sources rather than questioning their accuracy. But the plague has revealed limitations in this classical knowledge that cannot be explained away or ignored. If Galen's humoral theory were correct, bloodletting should cure plague victims. If Hippocrates' environmental medicine were accurate, your aromatic mask should provide protection. If Arabic medical authorities were reliable, Theriac should function as advertised. The systematic failure of established medical approaches suggests that something is fundamentally wrong with the theoretical foundations of medieval science. This realization opens terrifying possibilities. If classical authorities could be wrong about medicine, what other accepted truths might be equally questionable? Your house, when you finally reach it, feels like a refuge from these troubling thoughts, but also like a prison where you must confront the gap between your public role and private doubts. Inside these walls, you can remove the costume that marks you as a medical authority and admit your powerlessness against bacterial infection. Claire, your wife, greets you from across the room with the same careful distance that has characterized your relationship since you accepted the position of plague doctor. She's prepared your evening meal and left it outside your chamber door, maintaining household routines that provide stability during catastrophic social disruption. But tonight, something in her expression suggests that she's beginning to share your doubts about medical effectiveness. Perhaps she's noticed that you return home each evening more discouraged than hopeful. Perhaps she's heard rumors about the high mortality rates among your patients. Perhaps she simply observed that the plague continues spreading despite the presence of multiple physicians in the city. Medieval wives were often more perceptive observers of their husbands' professional struggles than historical records suggest. Women's exclusion from formal education didn't prevent them from developing sophisticated understanding of practical effectiveness. Claire may not have studied medical theory, but she can certainly observe that your treatments don't save lives. Your evening meal consists of bread, cheese, and watered wine, simple foods that have become luxury items as the plague disrupts agricultural production and trade networks. Many of the farmers who once supplied your city have died or fled, leaving fields unharvested and markets understocked. The economic consequences of catastrophic mortality extend far beyond immediate medical costs. Entire industries have collapsed as skilled workers die faster than they can be replaced. Trade networks have broken down as merchant communities abandon plague-infected cities. Agricultural production has declined as rural populations flee to avoid disease. Medieval society depended on complex webs of economic relationship that could be disrupted by relatively small changes in population or production. The plague's massive mortality has shattered these relationships so thoroughly that recovery will require decades even after the bacterial infection finally burns itself out through lack of susceptible hosts. As you eat your simple meal and reflect on the day's futile medical efforts, you're aware that you're witnessing the end of an era in human history. The confident medieval synthesis of classical knowledge, Christian theology, and practical experience is collapsing under pressure from a bacterial enemy that none of these intellectual traditions can understand or combat. The world that emerges from the plague will be fundamentally different from the one that existed before it. Medical practice will be forced to become more empirical and less theoretical. Social hierarchies will be restructured by massive population changes. Economic systems will be rebuilt around new realities of labor scarcity and resource distribution. But these changes lie in the future. Tonight, you are still Dr. Guillaume de Montpellier, plague doctor, wearing a leather costume that doesn't work, prescribing treatments that don't help, maintaining hope that has no rational foundation. Tomorrow you will put on the mask again and continue the ancient human tradition of fighting death with whatever tools are available, regardless of their effectiveness. The church bells toll midnight as you prepare for bed, their bronze voices counting the hours that remain until you must resume your impossible work. In a few hours, you'll wake to news of new deaths, new patients, new evidence that your medical knowledge is inadequate against bacterial infection. But you'll also wake to the continuing human need for healing, comfort, and hope, needs that transcend the practical limitations of 14th century medicine. Your mask may not work, your treatments may be useless, your theories may be wrong, but your presence represents something more fundamental than medical effectiveness. You embody humanity's refusal to surrender to mortality without a fight, the determination to seek healing even when healing seems impossible, the conviction that knowledge and compassion matter even in the face of overwhelming ignorance and powerlessness. The leather costume hanging beside your bed will transform you tomorrow morning from Guillaume the man into the plague doctor, that iconic figure who walked fearlessly among the dying carrying false hope in aromatic herbs and ineffective remedies. But perhaps false hope, during humanity's darkest hours, serves a purpose that transcends its factual accuracy, keeping communities functioning, maintaining social bonds, preserving the belief that tomorrow might be better than today. The weeks that follow blur together in a haze of ineffective treatments and mounting casualties. You continue your daily rounds, donning the leather costume each morning with mechanical precision, visiting patients whose outcomes you can no longer influence, prescribing remedies that provide comfort to families even when they cannot cure disease. The routine has become a meditation on the meaning of medical practice when medicine itself proves powerless. Your city, once home to nearly 20,000 souls, has been reduced to perhaps 5,000 survivors scattered across neighborhoods that feel vast and empty now that so many houses stand vacant. The plague has burned through the population like fire through dry timber, leaving behind a landscape of abandonment punctuated by small clusters of the living who huddle together for warmth, protection, and the simple comfort of human company. But something unexpected begins to happen as autumn deepens into winter. The rate of new infection starts to slow. Not because your treatments have suddenly become effective, not because the population has discovered protective measures that actually work, but because the plague has simply run out of readily susceptible hosts. The bacterial infection that seemed unstoppable just months ago is beginning to exhaust itself through its own devastating success. Medieval people couldn't understand this phenomenon in terms of herd immunity or bacterial ecology, but they could observe its effects. Fewer new cases appeared each week. Some patients who contracted the plague actually survived, their bodies somehow mounting successful immune responses that medical science couldn't explain or replicate. The constant tolling of death bells began to give way to longer periods of silence. You notice these changes during your daily rounds, though you're careful not to attribute them to medical intervention. The families you visit seem marginally less desperate, slightly more hopeful, as if some fundamental shift in the plague's momentum has become apparent even to people without medical training. Children who have been kept hidden indoors for months begin to appear briefly on doorsteps. Merchants start to discuss tentative plans for reopening shops. The survivors you encounter have been changed by their experience in ways that will shape the rest of their lives. They've witnessed mass mortality that challenged every assumption about divine justice, social order, and human knowledge. They've learned that neither wealth nor virtue nor education provides reliable protection against bacterial infection. They've seen their communities reduced to fragments and their certainties reduced to questions. Medieval society had been built on stable hierarchies and unchanging traditions that provided security through predictability. But the plague has demonstrated that stability is illusory, that change can be sudden and catastrophic, that human institutions are far more fragile than their creators believed. The world that emerges from this bacterial devastation will be forced to accommodate new levels of uncertainty and new acceptance of human limitation. Your own transformation parallels that of your community. The confident physician who donned the plague doctor costume for the first time 3 months ago no longer exists. In his place stands someone who understands that medical knowledge has boundaries, that healing involves more than technical intervention, that the relationship between doctor and patient transcends the practical effectiveness of available treatments. This transformation hasn't made you a better physician in any conventional sense. Your patients are no more likely to recover now than they were when you began. But it has made you a different kind of healer, someone who can provide comfort without false promises, who can offer presence without pretending to offer cures, who can acknowledge powerlessness without abandoning responsibility. Medieval medicine was slowly, painfully learning lessons that wouldn't be fully integrated into medical practice for centuries to come. The plague was teaching physicians that diseases could be beyond human control, that treatments could be harmful as well as helpful, that healing required humility as much as knowledge. These lessons came at enormous cost, paid in the lives of patients and practitioners alike. One grey December morning, you wake to discover that no new plague cases have been reported in your district for an entire week. The significance of this milestone takes time to register. After months of daily catastrophe, the absence of disaster feels almost suspicious, as if the bacterial enemy might be preparing some new assault rather than actually retreating. But as days pass without new infections, the reality becomes undeniable. The plague is ending, not through human victory but through bacterial exhaustion. Your city has become too depopulated to sustain continued transmission. The survivors have developed some measure of immunity through exposure or natural resistance. The ecological conditions that allowed Yersinia pestis to flourish have been altered by the very devastation it created. The end comes not with celebration but with a kind of stunned silence, as if the surviving population needs time to process the reality that they will not, after all, be joining the tens of thousands who have died over these terrible months. There are no victory parades for defeats that simply peter out through attrition. There are no heroes to celebrate when survival depended more on luck than on skill or virtue. You continue wearing your plague doctor costume for several more weeks, partly because isolated cases still appear occasionally, partly because the ritual of donning the leather robes and bird-like mask has become so central to your identity that abandoning it feels like losing part of yourself. The costume that began as protection has become a form of armor against a world that no longer makes complete sense. But gradually, inevitably, the practical demands of a city trying to rebuild itself require you to resume something approaching normal medical practice. People need treatment for injuries, assistance with childbirth, care for the chronic conditions that existed before the plague and will continue long after it ends. Your expensive education, however inadequate it proved against bacterial infection, still provides valuable knowledge for treating the ordinary medical problems that define most of human experience. The transition from plague doctor back to regular physician proves surprisingly difficult. After months of confronting mortality daily, treating a broken arm or a difficult pregnancy feels almost trivial. After accepting your powerlessness against bacterial infection, claiming authority over more mundane medical conditions requires rebuilding confidence that has been thoroughly shattered. Your first post-plague patient is a young carpenter who has injured his hand while trying to repair damage to his workshop. The injury is serious but straightforward, a deep cut that needs cleaning, stitching, and careful monitoring to prevent infection. Your medical training provides clear guidance for treatment, and your experience gives you reasonable confidence about the likely outcome. But as you examine the wound without your plague doctor costume, working with your bare hands instead of maintaining careful distance with a staff, you're acutely aware of how different this medical encounter feels from those that defined the past several months. Here is a problem that medical knowledge can actually address: a patient who will probably benefit from intervention, a situation where your training and experience provide genuine advantages. The carpenter watches your face as you work, and you realize that he's seeing not the terrifying plague doctor of recent months but simply a physician doing ordinary medical work. The leather mask and aromatic herbs that seemed so important during the plague are irrelevant for treating traumatic injuries. What matters now is practical knowledge about wound care, surgical technique, and infection prevention. Medieval medicine was actually quite effective at treating many conditions, despite its failures against plague and other diseases that wouldn't be understood until the development of germ theory. Physicians could set broken bones, deliver babies, perform cataract surgery, and treat various ailments with reasonable success rates. The plague's devastating mortality had temporarily overshadowed these more modest but genuine medical capabilities. As you stitch the carpenter's wound and bandage his hand, you find yourself rediscovering satisfaction in medical work that produces measurable results. The cut edges of his wound align properly under your careful suturing. The bleeding stops in response to pressure and elevation. The patient's pain decreases as you apply numbing herbs and position his hand for optimal healing. These small successes feel almost miraculous after months of medical futility. Here is evidence that human knowledge can sometimes triumph over bodily dysfunction, that skilled intervention can improve outcomes, that the relationship between physician and patient can be genuinely therapeutic rather than merely symbolic. The carpenter thanks you with sincere gratitude that carries no undertones of desperate hope or impending despair. He expects to heal because his injury is the kind that medical science can actually treat effectively. His confidence in your abilities is based on realistic assessment of what medicine can accomplish within its legitimate sphere of competence. This encounter marks the beginning of your gradual return to normal medical practice, though normal now carries different meanings than it did before the plague. You approach each patient with greater humility about the limitations of medical knowledge. You're more honest about uncertainty, more cautious about promising outcomes, more willing to admit when conditions exceed your ability to treat effectively. Medieval physicians who survived plague epidemics often emerged with transformed understanding of their profession's capabilities and limitations. They'd witnessed the failure of their most confident theories and expensive treatments. They'd learned that diseases could be beyond human control regardless of the resources devoted to fighting them. They discovered that healing involved psychological and spiritual dimensions that purely technical approaches couldn't address. but they'd also learned that medical knowledge, however incomplete, still had genuine value within its proper scope. The same training that proved useless against bacterial infection could effectively treat traumatic injuries, assist with difficult births, and provide relief for various chronic conditions. Medicine's failures against plague didn't negate its successes in other areas. Your practice slowly rebuilds as your city survivors begin the long process of reconstructing their lives and communities. Families that lost members to the plague need medical care for those who remain. Children who survived infection often suffer lingering health effects that require ongoing attention. Workers rebuilding damaged infrastructure sustain injuries that need treatment. Each of these cases reinforces your growing understanding that medicine's proper role is more modest but also more sustainable than the grandiose claims that characterized pre-plague medical culture. You can't cure every disease or prevent every death, but you can provide skilled care within the boundaries of current knowledge while honestly acknowledging those boundaries to patients and families. The leather costume that defined your identity as a plague doctor hangs unused in your chamber, a reminder of humanity's capacity for both ignorance and nobility. The aromatic mask didn't protect you from bacterial infection, but it symbolized your willingness to risk death in service of healing. The ineffective treatments didn't cure your patients, but they represented medicine's commitment to fighting disease with whatever tools were available. Medieval people understood that symbols could carry meaning that transcended their practical effectiveness. The plague doctor's costume had failed as protection but succeeded as representation, embodying the human refusal to surrender to mortality without struggle, the determination to seek healing even when healing seemed impossible, the conviction that knowledge and compassion mattered even in the face of overwhelming ignorance and powerlessness. Years later, when other physicians ask about your experience during the plague months, you find it difficult to explain the peculiar mixture of futility and purpose that characterized that time. How do you describe the satisfaction of providing comfort when you cannot provide cures? How do you explain the meaning found in rituals that had no practical effectiveness? How do you convey the strange nobility of failing completely while refusing to abandon hope? The plague passes into memory and eventually into history, but its lessons continue to shape medical practice for generations. Physicians become more humble about their limitations, more honest about uncertainty, more realistic about what medicine can and cannot accomplish. The confident assertions that characterized medieval medical education give way to more provisional approaches that acknowledge the incompleteness of human knowledge. But perhaps most importantly, the plague teaches that healing involves more than technical competence. The relationship between physician and patient encompasses elements that transcend the practical effectiveness of available treatments. Sometimes the most important thing a doctor can provide is simply the willingness to remain present with suffering, to bear witness to mortality, to represent hope even when hope has no rational foundation. Your plague doctor costume remains in your chamber as the seasons turn and your city slowly rebuilds itself around its reduced population. Children who never knew the pre-plague world grow up in communities that have been permanently changed by bacterial devastation. Stories about the plague months become part of local folklore, told and retold until they acquire the mythic quality that transforms historical trauma into cultural memory. And in those stories, the plague doctor occupies a central but ambiguous role, neither hero nor villain, neither savior nor charlatan, but something more complex and human. A figure who represents medicine's eternal struggle against mortality, the persistence of hope in the face of overwhelming evidence, the human capacity to find meaning in failure and purpose in powerlessness. The mask didn't work. The treatments were useless. The theories were wrong. But the commitment to healing, however imperfect, somehow mattered anyway. Not because it cured disease, but because it affirmed something essential about human nature, the refusal to accept suffering as inevitable, the determination to seek solutions even when solutions don't exist, the conviction that caring for one another is valuable regardless of practical outcomes. And perhaps that's the most profound lesson the plague doctors left behind, not in their medical texts or their treatment records, but in their simple persistence. Night after night, they put on costumes that didn't protect them. Day after day, they administered remedies that couldn't cure disease. Month after month, they walked through streets filled with death, carrying hope in leather pouches and compassion in aromatic herbs. They failed, by every practical measure. Their patients died at the same rates whether treated or untreated. Their expensive educations proved worthless against bacterial enemies they couldn't see or understand. Their confident theories crumbled when confronted with the reality of a pandemic that recognized no social distinctions and respected no medical authority. But in failing so completely, they taught us something more valuable than any cure could have provided. They showed us that the human response to suffering doesn't depend on the ability to eliminate that suffering. They demonstrated that caring for one another matters even when caring accomplishes nothing measurable. They proved that hope can survive the destruction of every rational basis for hope. The leather costume hanging in your chamber will eventually decay and crumble, as all material things must. The aromatic herbs will lose their scent and turn to dust. The medical theories that justified your treatments will be discarded and forgotten as human knowledge slowly, painfully advances toward better understanding of disease and healing. But something else will persist, something harder to define but impossible to destroy. The memory of figures in bird-like masks walking fearlessly through plague-stricken streets. The image of physicians who continued practicing medicine even when medicine proved powerless. The example of humans who refused to abandon their commitment to healing even when healing became impossible. That persistence, that stubborn insistence on caring for one another regardless of practical outcomes, that determination to fight darkness even with tools that don't work, these qualities transcend the specific historical moment of medieval plague. They represent something essential about human nature that appears whenever communities face overwhelming challenges. Medieval plague doctors were neither heroes nor fools, neither saviors nor charlatans. They were people doing the best they could with the knowledge and tools available to them, maintaining their commitment to healing even when healing meant nothing more than presence, witness, and the simple affirmation that suffering matters and lives have value. Their legacy lives on not in medical textbooks but in every nurse who sits with dying patients, every doctor who admits uncertainty while continuing to care, every person who shows up for others even when showing up can't change outcomes. The plague doctor's mask becomes a symbol for all the times humans choose compassion over safety, hope over despair, connection over isolation. As you settle deeper into sleep in your quiet chamber, your breathing slow and regular now, you can almost hear the echo of footsteps on medieval cobblestones, the measured pace of someone carrying healing herbs through empty streets, someone wearing a leather mask that doesn't work but somehow still matters, someone who understood that the most important human qualities aren't always the most effective ones. The plague doctors are gone, but their spirit remains wherever people choose to care for one another despite uncertainty, wherever healing is practiced with humility rather than arrogance, wherever hope persists in the face of overwhelming evidence that hope might be foolish. Their greatest gift to history wasn't medical, it was moral, a reminder that humans at their best don't abandon each other even when abandon would be safer, smarter, more practical. In your dreams tonight, you might find yourself walking once more through those medieval streets, but now they're not empty, they're filled with the spirits of all those who came after, all those who learned from the plague doctor's example. You see nurses in modern hospitals, sitting beside patients through long, dark nights when medicine has reached its limits. You see doctors in remote villages, treating diseases they can't fully cure but refusing to abandon those who suffer. You see researchers in laboratories, methodically pursuing answers that may take decades to find, driven by the same stubborn hope that once filled aromatic herbs into leather masks. The cobblestones beneath your feet echo with the footsteps of centuries, plague doctors giving way to physicians who discovered bacteria, who developed vaccines, who learned to fight infections with knowledge rather than just courage. But each breakthrough was built on the foundation of those who came before, those who maintained the human commitment to healing even when healing seemed impossible. You see the truth now, as sleep carries you deeper into peaceful rest, the plague doctors weren't failures at all. They were links in an unbroken chain of human compassion that stretches from medieval streets to modern hospitals, from aromatic masks to surgical masks, from theriac and bloodletting to antibiotics and advanced surgery. Each generation builds on the courage of those who went before, adding knowledge but preserving the essential commitment to care for one another. The leather costume in your chamber isn't just a relic of medical ignorance, it's a monument to medical courage. Those who wore it understood something that transcends any particular era's knowledge, that the act of caring matters independently of the effectiveness of care, that showing up for suffering neighbors defines us as human beings more than our technical capabilities ever could. medieval plague doctors walking through empty streets with ineffective remedies, modern doctors working in understaffed emergency rooms with imperfect treatments, future healers we can't yet imagine working with tools we can't yet conceive. They're all connected by something deeper than medical knowledge. They're connected by the recognition that healing is as much about love as it is about science, as much about hope as it is about technique. The aromatic herbs in your mask may not have filtered out bacteria, but they filtered out despair. The leather robes may not have prevented infection, but they prevented the infection of hopelessness from spreading through communities already devastated by disease. The long wooden staff may not have cured anyone, but it reached across the distance that fear creates between people, maintaining connection when connection seemed dangerous. And perhaps that's what healing has always really been about, not the elimination of all suffering, which may be impossible, but the refusal to let suffering isolate us from one another. The plague doctors proved that medicine's greatest power might not lie in its ability to cure disease, but in its capacity to affirm that no one suffers alone, that human connection persists even in the face of mortality, that caring for one another is worth the risk even when the risk is everything. As you settle into the deepest levels of sleep, your breathing becomes slow and rhythmic, like the measured pace of those long-ago figures walking through plague-stricken streets. In your dreams, you carry forward their legacy, not their medical techniques, which proved inadequate, but their moral commitment, which proved indestructible. You understand now that every time someone chooses to help rather than flee, to stay rather than abandon, to hope rather than despair, they're wearing an invisible version of that leather mask and aromatic herbs. Every nurse working a double shift, every teacher in an underfunded school, every person who shows up for others when showing up is difficult, they're all plague doctors in spirit, carrying forward the ancient human tradition of caring for one another regardless of practical outcomes. The medieval world that produced the plague doctors is gone, swept away by centuries of change, progress, and discovery. But the world they helped create, a world where caring for others is seen as fundamental to human nature, where healing is understood as both science and art, where hope persists even in the face of overwhelming evidence, that world continues. Their leather masks crumbled into dust long ago, but their legacy lives on in every medical mask worn to protect others, every hand held in comfort, every word of encouragement offered to someone facing uncertainty. The aromatic herbs that filled their beaks have lost their scent, but the fragrance of human compassion still perfumes every hospital room, every clinic, every place where people gather to heal and be healed. Sleep deeply now, knowing that you're part of this continuing story. Whether you're a healer by profession or simply by nature, whether you cure with medicine or with kindness, whether you fight disease with technology or with presence, you carry forward the plague doctor's most important discovery, that love is the only remedy that never loses its potency, the only treatment that never becomes obsolete, the only hope that never expires. Let your dreams be filled with the gentle sounds of a world healing, not because all disease has been conquered, which may never happen, but because humans continue choosing to care for one another despite uncertainty, continue showing up for suffering despite risk, continue believing in tomorrow despite today's evidence that tomorrow might bring new challenges. The plague doctor's greatest victory wasn't medical, it was moral. They proved that humans at their best don't calculate the odds before offering help, don't require certainty before providing comfort, don't demand effectiveness before demonstrating love. They showed us that caring for one another is what makes us human, and that this caring matters more than any particular outcome it might or might not produce. Rest peacefully in this knowledge, and let the memory of those long-ago figures in bird-like masks remind you that hope, however irrational it might seem, remains humanity's most powerful medicine, not because it cures everything, but because it ensures that nothing, not even the darkest plague, can cure us of our essential humanity. Sweet dreams, filled with the quiet heroism of ordinary people doing extraordinary things simply by refusing to abandon each other, by choosing connection over safety, by wearing invisible masks of compassion that actually do work, protecting not our bodies but our souls, not our health but our humanity. The church bells fall silent now, their work done, their message delivered, that love endures, that hope persists, and that the human commitment to healing, however imperfect, however inadequate, however futile it might sometimes seem, remains our greatest triumph over the darkness that would otherwise consume us all.